Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Dr. Runa Chakraborty Paunksnis about Bama's Sangati. In this part, we discussed the very direct language of the text, the question of whether Sangati is in fact a novel or another type of text entirely, and how the text was received. If you haven't yet listened to the first part, I suggest that you check that out first, and if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of my conversation about Sangati by Bama with Runa Chakraborty Paunksnis. If you didn't catch the first part, I do suggest you check that out first, as we are picking up from where we left off. And towards the end of the first part of our conversation, you mentioned, a constant feature of these women's lives is the threat of sexual exploitation. And I wanted to ask about the language that's used, because a lot of the language is, we might say, obscene, or at least refers to, say, genitalia and sexual bodily functions really quite bluntly. There's not much euphemism there. And I think, it got me thinking I can think of many examples of literature where, for example, swear words or, use of bodily functions is kind of transgressive in a kind of attempt to sort of puncture hypocritical social norms, sort of punching up against the snobbery of the upper or middle classes, for example. Do you think that's what's happening in Sangati, or is the sort of obscene and bodily language doing something a little bit different here?
Well, it's interesting you asked this question. Actually, a lot of criticism that was heaped on Sangati was because of the language that Bama used here. If you read the introduction to this book, you'd see that a couple of arguments were put forward regarding the usage of language. One argument that is that the kind of language these women they're using, like we may call it quote unquote vulgar or obscene language, that was a way of defending themselves from the violence that's inflicted on them by men. So kind of a defense mechanism. Another argument is that they use this language because they internalize the patriarchal language of sexual dominance and power, or simply because another argument is that they use this language because they might not have enough pleasurable experiences in their lives. So there can be different arguments, and in fact, I think other dimensions as well. For example, if you look at these women, most of these women, they didn't go to school. Many of them who went to a school couldn't complete their studies. So you might say that it is coming out of that sense of so-called quote-unquote unrefinement, if we may say it. But if the question is why Bama retained this language, I would say that this is very much a political act. In fact, Dalit writing itself is a political act. And in a couple of interviews, even Bama talked about this usage of language, and she mentioned that it was a very, it was a decision that she took quite consciously. I mean, that keeping that kind of a language, because this is where they can actually break the sort of you might say the parameters that are set by the upper caste elite, urban, educated men. So this is definitely the way you are saying that this is a transgression. Evidently, this is a case of transgression, a kind of criticism against the kind of I would say it's a sort of imposition on Dalit people, and how this imposition is working, and it's basically exposing that, and this is a protest against that sort of parameters set by the upper caste, urban, educated elite men.
Okay.
Yes, that I would say it's a stated design.
Okay. So, I mean, we've touched so far, we just mentioned some of the language or one aspect of that, and we talked a little bit about the nature of the events that are covered, that the sort of the scope of the novel is quite small geographically, right? So, putting those together in terms of the style and the form of the novel, do you think it's trying to position itself with respect to other types of literature, other genres of literature? Is it trying to fit into a particular category, or rejecting that very deliberately? Where do we kind of position this novel?
Well, yeah, often it is described as a novel, but it is also dubbed as an autobiography of a community. So even if it is a novel, I mean, people call it a novel, you wouldn't see those standard features of novel in it. In fact, you'd see that there are multiple narratives that are here, and the voices of women that are very loud and clear in this, and they're all put together, and you can distinctly hear the voices of these women in spite of the strong presence of a narrator. And this is, I mean, the whole text is about a Dalit Christian community, and especially the experiences of the women of that community and their struggle, their joys, their sorrows and happiness, and not that the way we expect a novel to work. So I would rather be a bit reluctant to use the word novel and wouldn't categorize it as a novel. But I don't think that it's trying to reject a particular genre. Rather, it is trying to, I would like to see it as if it is trying to position itself as let's say autobiographical work, because in case of an autobiography, there is some sort of truth claim involved, and as if maybe the writer was trying to kind of position it as something that is real rather than completely fictional, which might be the case if it is categorized as a novel. So so I think that's why there is some sort of, again, a protest is going on here. It's not exactly that it is rejecting, rather it is positioning itself as an autobiographical work. Yeah, that's how I would like to see it.
Okay, yeah, I think those are, you're the expert here, but very good points in terms of its form. It doesn't read like we might expect a novel to read, where you sort of follow a protagonist through events of whatever sort to a kind of conclusion. It definitely resists that kind of categorization here. And you spoke of it as a kind of protest, and that implies there's an audience here that it's sort of perhaps one audience it's appealing to, another audience maybe it's pushing back against. And you also mentioned actually some interviews, for example, and people theorizing about her use of language. So can I ask about how the novel has been received in India and elsewhere? Has that reception been mixed? Has it been widely read, or is it still quite niche? All of these kinds of questions are something I'd be interested to hear about.
Well, yeah, when it was originally published in the 90s, it definitely created a star because, as I mentioned, that Bama kind of broke all these so-called decorum that was already there in Tamil literature. So she broke the written form of grammar, the spelling, and also, and she used Tamil Dalit dialect consistently throughout the book. I mean, in the original version. And so people who are not happy with that kind of transgression, they definitely opposed, and they were criticizing, and even there are people who are they were asking questions, they were questioning the entire work, whether it is a piece of literature or not. And if you allow me, then probably I can just quote one Dalit scholar. Let me just find out if I get it here. And his name is Raj Gautaman, and he actually said why Dalit literature is so important, and why they should use this kind of language. And here he is saying that the parameters that are set by the upper caste-led modern language proprietors consider the language of the Dalits as vulgar and obscene. And he says that Dalit writers purposefully disrupt this process, and I'm quoting him, they expose and discredit the existing language, its grammar, its refinements, and its falsifying order as symbols of dominance. End quote.
Okay.
So, we see that obviously, there is this protest against the kind of decorum that was in place, and many people who believed in that decorum, in that propriety, in that refinement, which is definitely again set by the upper caste, elite, urban, educated men, many of them were not happy with that. But I would say that now Sangati is highly appreciated, and it is considered by many, including me, as one of the pioneering Dalit feminist texts that actually opened avenues for us to think of Dalit women's vulnerability and their predicament as they are located in the intersection of different social categories. And as far as the international readership is concerned, I would say that Sangati is translated in English. This version that we are talking about is published, I think, in 2005. And also it is translated in French. So this has, Sangati, definitely when it is translated into different languages, it can reach out to many people who are otherwise not familiar with this kind of literature. And it's not just, we shouldn't just talk about other countries, but India itself is a multilingual country. So, for example, I didn't have any access to this text unless it was translated in English. So I read this text in 2008, I believe. So around that time, maybe 3 years after it was translated in English. So, when it was translated in English, it actually could speak to many people. You might say a niche in a sense that, yes, those who are studying Dalit literature, the scholars who are researching, they are more aware of Sangati. But at the same time, it also has an impact on general people because Bama's other work, the first work, Karukku, which was originally published in 1992, and then later it was also translated in English. That book won this crossword book award. And Bama herself, in fact, in this year, 2024, she was awarded by the government of Tamil Nadu. There is a particular award, Ivor Award, and she received that award. So, of course, there is some kind of reception there in the general, public. You can say that if general public, they are aware of or not, of Bama or not, yes, of course, they are aware of her. But if we talk about the merit of a particular text, maybe that is more examined by scholars, not by general people.
Sure. And my follow-up question, which I think maybe some of what you said answered a little bit already, was, you mentioned that the language she was using was transgressive, and the nature of the text itself is a novel. All these questions, is not conforming to the parameters, as you've said, of what was dictated from above. And from what you've just said, it sounds like there has been a shift, and that this literature is now more acceptable. Is that right? So to what extent?
Well,
okay, go on.
Yeah, please go on. No, you go on.
Well, and I was going to ask, how instrumental was Sangati in affecting any change there has been, or is this part of a bigger kind of movement and shift in mood as well? And are there other texts involved in doing that?
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, in a sense that Sangati has a very strong presence in the entire, body of Dalit literature. If you talk about Dalit feminist literature more precisely, because as I mentioned already, that in the 90s when it was published, there was this interest in Dalit literature, definitely, and it was there in Tamil context for a long time. But the way now it is being received, now it is being talked about or being researched, that interest was not there back in the 90s. Still, it was coming up. And as far as Sangati is concerned, as I mentioned, that Sangati shows how Dalit women are located at the intersections of all these social categories. So their experience is very different from an upper caste woman's experience. We just cannot have one big umbrella term as woman or Indian woman. Rather, we should talk more about the heterogeneity that is there in that category itself. And that helps a lot when it comes to the social movements, because one big question that is always asked nowadays, and based on all this literature, Sangati is one of them, that Dalit women's movement, nor they were addressed in the women's movement in India. So that's why the whole debate is that whether we should have a Dalit feminist movement to address their questions. And if you read Sangati, then you would understand why this question is so very important, that Dalit women's experiences are very unique, yes. And therefore, I can say that it has created a very big impact on Dalit literature in general.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to go back to the issue of language. You mentioned it's written in Tamil originally, so for you, it's only accessible once it's translated to English. Even for, the Anglophone reader who's reading this translation, a lot of words are italicized, so they're in Roman script and you can pronounce them roughly. I'm about to say one and we'll probably mispronounce it. But they, you don't know what they mean, right? So let me give some examples. On the first page, the narrator refers to her grandmother as a Paraichi, and then she's called Patti, right? And Patti is capitalized, but this isn't, the narrator's already given the name of a grandmother. It's not the same name. So we're left kind of wondering what these terms mean, okay? And we can sort of guess, but we're not sure of the exact meaning. So, I know you may be guessing to some extent or hypothesizing here, but what do you think? Did you get a sense of the rationale for words like this being left untranslated?
Well, these two terms that you mentioned here, Patti and Paraichi, well, I'm also not a Tamil-speaking person, so I don't know whether I'm pronouncing them correctly or not. But these two terms are also explained in the glossary, which comes at the end of the book. Patti means grandmother, and Paraichi means a woman who belongs to a Pariah caste, which is one particular low caste community. When you use the word Paraichi, it reveals that the woman belongs to a low caste community. In this case, the narrator's grandmother belongs to a low caste community. So it's a kind of an indicator showing that the person belongs to a low caste community. Well, it actually may be very confusing for someone who is not familiar with these specific terms, and especially if a word like Patti is capitalized, because it somehow flouts the norms of the grammar. But I can say from my own experience of translating Bengali Dalit short stories and plays into English that it is very difficult to translate each and every emotion and expression that is there in the source language. I'm sure any translator finds that quite difficult thing to do. And recently, you mentioned that also, recently I was working on an anthology of Dalit plays. And when I was translating a play, and I felt the same dilemma, whether to translate everything that is there into a refined English, so to say, or even not refined English, rather colloquial English, and whether if I do that, whether the word will be actually, the meaning will be actually expressed or not. So in certain cases, I left these words, some of the expressions, untranslated. and then I explain the meaning in the glossary. So I think there is a dilemma often, and that whether to translate it or not to translate. I mean, you can say, yes, what's the big deal? Instead of Pati, if I say grandmother, what's the big deal? But probably the kind of flavor that you are seeking when you are translating a text, that will be lost. If you simply say grandmother, or even if you say granny, grandma in different ways, So I think that was the call that the translator took.
Yeah, it does give the sense the connotation must just be something a little bit different from the maybe more familiar term, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Runa, for a really fascinating conversation about a text that, I'm sure a lot of readers not familiar with Dalit literature in general. So thank you for shedding light on this particular area of literature. And thank you for, your time and your insights. We'll finish this part of the conversation now. We will be back for the third part, in which Runa will give some further recommendations on similar or related texts. So please do join us for that third part very soon. Thank you.